Imagine a world where gender roles were shaped by survival. Intimacy was negotiated amidst the noise of crowded taverns, and contraceptive methods resembled alchemical experiments more than healthcare. The Old West is a setting we know for duels, saloons, and endless deserts. But what happened behind closed doors is even more intriguing, and often bizarre. Society at the time dealt with taboos in unexpected ways, mixing pragmatism with pure improvisation. Prostitution was a business, privacy was a luxury, and gender roles, contrary to popular belief, were constantly challenged. Ready to uncover stories that feel like they're straight out of a movie but are as real as the sound of a pistol being cocked? Get ready for a journey into a past where sexuality was a raw reflection of a society that pushed its own limits. In the Old West, the scarcity of women created a peculiar market where saloon houses thrived as epicenters of social and economic interaction. Sex workers weren't just providers of companionship. They also filled emotional voids in a harsh and isolated environment. Beyond offering moments of relief in a tense society, they faced challenges few could understand. Violence, for example, was a constant threat, and access to healthcare was limited to herbal remedies or makeshift treatments. Some, more resourceful, invested their earnings in small properties or businesses, striving to escape the cycle. It was a fight for survival, but also an act of silent resistance. The local economy revolved around these encounters, driving everything from the sale of drinks to lodging services. For travelers, it was a promise of warmth in barren lands. However, the cost of this dynamic fell on the women, who bore the weight of prejudice and social invisibility. It's fascinating how, even in such an adverse setting, strategies of adaptation and new social roles emerged, leading us to reflect on how gender roles adapted to this reality. In the Old West, the concept of gender identity was surprisingly more flexible than one might imagine. Many women, seeking to escape the limitations imposed on them, adopted male identities to access rights, jobs, or even safety. Picture a young woman dressed in men's clothing, wielding a gun to freely ride and protect what was hers. A bold act by today's standards, but pure survival back then. Sexuality also had a practical and fluid character, without the labels we know today. Relationships were often defined by convenience, fleeting affection, or the need for companionship. Stories of unlikely partnerships and unexpected bonds reveal a society that, despite its many judgments, knew how to pragmatically handle the nuances of intimacy. It teaches us that survival, at its core, always finds a way. Of course, this freedom had limits imposed by the morality of the time, but norms weren't immutable. Cross-dressing and non-conventional relationships coexisted with the puritanism of some communities. What does this tell us? That even in seemingly rigid contexts, people found ways to live their truths. And if we dig deeper, we'll see how this society navigated intimacy in a context where even privacy was a luxury. Privacy in the Old West was as rare as water in a desert. For poorer families, sharing a single room was common, leaving no space for secrets or moments of intimacy. Imagine a small wooden shack where parents, children, and even guests shared the same space. Every sigh, every movement, all in plain view. The lack of physical comfort was just one layer of this daily reality. For the wealthy, the story was different. Large houses with multiple rooms ensured the luxury of individuality, a privilege that further highlighted social disparities. While the less fortunate dealt with the constraints of close quarters, the affluent could enjoy closed windows and locked doors. This disparity wasn't just material, but also shaped relationships and hierarchies within communities. Interestingly, this lack of privacy also fostered a culture of forced transparency, where taboos were constantly challenged by physical proximity. Social norms adapted to this reality, and improvisation became the rule. It's fascinating how, even in this context, people still found ways to express their individuality. And this connects us to another delicate point: health risks and rudimentary care methods. In the Old West, contraception was a high-risk gamble, with available options being rudimentary and often dangerous. Women resorted to homemade methods, such as herbal teas or toxic substances, in hopes of avoiding unwanted pregnancies. Imagine the anguish of depending on something that could solve a problem or cause irreparable harm. It was a choice between the uncertain and the inevitable. Sex workers were especially vulnerable to these risks, as the lack of protection exposed them to severe complications. Without access to reliable doctors or safe treatments, they often depended on midwives or healers for risky procedures. These moments of desperation highlight the precarious health conditions and the burden these women carried as they made tough decisions to protect their autonomy. Despite the precariousness, there was a shared knowledge among women, with tips about herbs or supposedly effective practices being passed around. This sense of community, though valuable, was also filled with misinformation. Reflecting on these practices helps us understand how neglected intimate health was, and how it directly impacted power and gender dynamics. And speaking of power, gender-based violence loomed as a constant shadow over these women's lives. Gender-based violence in the Old West was a cruel reality, largely ignored by the authorities of the time. Women, especially sex workers and indigenous women, were constantly vulnerable to physical and psychological abuse. Imagine living in a place where justice seemed reserved for white men while the rest of society suffered in the silence imposed by inequality and fear. Some women, however, found ways to resist. They created support networks, helping each other face adversities. In larger towns, it was common for sex workers to organize themselves to offer mutual protection, subtly but effectively challenging the system. These gestures, though small, symbolized the resilience of those who refused to be reduced to the role of a victim. Unfortunately, violence also permeated intimate relationships, where both dialogue and consent were often absent. This harsh reality makes us think about how the social norms of the time legitimized abusive practices while silencing voices calling for change. But amidst this darkness, there were those who dared to question gender norms and challenge expectations, paving the way for a more flexible society, as we'll explore next. In the Old West, cross-dressing wasn't just a form of expression, but also a tool for survival and independence. Many women chose to dress as men to escape the social limitations imposed on their gender. Imagine a woman cutting her hair short, wearing pants, and assuming a new name to work in a mine or become a trader. It was a reinvention that required courage and cunning. What's even more fascinating is that this behavior wasn't exclusive to women. Men also challenged gender norms, often wearing women's clothing in theatrical settings or even to avoid military responsibilities. These stories, though poorly documented, reveal a society more flexible than traditional history suggests. Breaking norms was a quiet form of resistance and, in many cases, a cry for freedom. This subversion of societal expectations leads us to another intriguing point: how people understood sexuality and education in a time when myths and misinformation reigned. In the Old West, sexual education was practically non-existent, replaced by myths and religious prejudices that confused more than they clarified. Many believed that sexually transmitted diseases were divine punishments, while dangerous remedies like mercury were used as cures. Imagine the desperation of relying on practices that caused more harm than good, a clear reflection of the era's misinformation. Young people learned about sexuality through informal conversations, often laden with taboos and euphemisms. These exchanges perpetuated misconceptions, such as abstinence being the only solution to avoid disease or unwanted pregnancies. In an environment where books were scarce and medical knowledge was limited, word of mouth shaped popular beliefs, a scenario that heightened vulnerability, especially for women. Interestingly, despite the lack of resources, some individuals dared to challenge these narratives, introducing discussions about intimate health and prevention methods. These pioneers faced resistance, but their actions paved the way for broader reflections on the body and sexuality. This pragmatic, albeit timid perspective revealed the need to address delicate topics more openly, something even the popular language of the time tried to do, as we'll see next. In the Old West, the language surrounding intimacy was as creative as the arid environment that shaped those people. Euphemisms and humorous expressions became essential tools for addressing taboo topics. Imagine two cowboys in a tavern talking about riding off into the sunset, while actually referring to intimate encounters. This use of humor and metaphor softened delicate subjects, making it possible to discuss them without causing discomfort. Additionally, the vocabulary reflected the need for practical communication. in a society that didn't always have time or space for elaborate language. Simple terms, loaded with meaning, helped maintain appearances while conveying clear messages. This created a culture where intimacy was viewed pragmatically, an adaptation to extreme conditions and a lack of privacy. This linguistic approach also helped build connections between people, even amidst adversities. Intimacy, though often veiled, was deeply human and present in all interactions. By exploring this cultural complexity, it becomes clear how language shaped people's views of themselves and others, concluding a fascinating reflection on the social paradoxes of the Old West. Now that you've uncovered the most fascinating and unexpected details of sexual life in the Old West, the question remains, what can we learn from it? Do the limitations, challenges, and adaptations of that time have something to teach us about resilience, creativity, and even how we handle taboos today? Reflecting on this might change how you see the past, and maybe even the present. If you enjoyed this dive into history, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way you can keep discovering surprising historical facts that might inspire your life. See you next time, because the next chapter of history is just beginning.